there. So thank you very much for having me. My name's Claire Brown. I'm a second year PhD researcher in the Tyndall Institute. I also have a real job where I look at kind of retrofit in social housing as well. I also sit on a board for a social landlord based in the south of Manchester. So very much housing, very much construction, and also really interested in how climate change and how understanding that is part of this solution. Right, can we stand over here? So I wanted to start off with kind of just introducing the scene in terms of social housing in the UK. So social housing is housing that is available for those deemed to be most vulnerable in society. There have been significant increases in the demand for that service, particularly post-COVID, but also as a result of lack of house building in the UK, poor housing standards. We see a whole range of different kind of social issues that come through when we're talking about social housing. I'm sure you're all very aware of kind of the damp and mould issue that is particularly prevalent at the moment, and social landlords have a fixed amount of budget at the moment to deal with that to the end of March, which I think is going to be a real challenge. But that highlights some of the big problems around social housing, how it could be potentially climate resilient, because that's what we need. We need housing that is going to be enabled to withstand those changing kind of climatic features. So it's a massive issue and something that we need to kind of really kind of focus on. Housing, as part of the proportion of carbon emissions is right up there. Not as much as transport, but it's still, my passions are really kind of important in that. But linking back to the social element, it is a massive determinant of health. So if you have poor housing and that has poor quality, it is likely that there will be some health-related issue that is there. That can be a physical problem resulting from lack of ventilation, poor ability to heat the home. It could be that there are actual kind of problems with it, damp, mould, pest infestation, a whole range of different things. So we need to recalibrate the issue around climate change in social housing. There are movements towards that, but my research is really thinking about how new UK social housing needs to really think about that climate resilience to enable those tenants to withstand the changes that they're going to face. So this is a kind of image of one of my case study homes, which is actually based in St Helens. What we find though, and kind of comes back to the policy, the guidance, is that we are seeing some benefits to new buildings that are kind of coming through and homes, but actually we haven't seen the scale and the rate of improvements to new homes. After the demise of the 2016 net zero homes requirement, we've seen about 800,000 new homes built in the UK to lower standards. At some point, those are going to need to be retrofitted, and those aren't just social housing, that's private rental and private ownership as well. If you have a look at the Fit for Future publication from the CCC, you'll find some critical comments on the status of where we need to be, where we're missing those policy improvements, where we're missing those regulation updates. So on the right-hand side, we've got this latest kind of report from the CCC. If you look at the very top, in the middle, that letter B is the final energy demand. And you can see that I think the status is listed as too early to say whether we're on track to meet that. We still have some optimism in that actually reducing the demand that we put into new homes, so the amount of energy that home will need to enable the tenants to have a level of thermal comfort, we're trying to reduce that. So my research is thinking about how heating demand is part of that, and I'll come on to this later, but also how cooling demand, even in the UK, is going to be part of that, and how that shifts that demand requirement a little bit. I put on this chart as well because actually when we look at social housing, it does actually perform better than the rest of the kind of the housing estate. So down the left-hand side is the score from an energy performance certificate. So out of the European Directive of Buildings Directive came a requirement to have an energy performance certificate for anything that is bought, sold, rented or leased. So that's properties across the board. You'll probably see them around campus, the display energy certificates. Go and have a look at those. But for social housing, what we want is the higher the score, because that means it's more energy efficient. So the tenants who are going to be living in there are using essentially the least amount of energy in there because it's efficient. And that's what we want, because if you're having to pay for energy, and we all know what the cost of living has done, it is a massive, massive challenge. When we're going forward, we want to address climate change. We want to reduce the amount of energy, particularly fossil fuel related energy sources. The UK government still says that we need to be building about 300,000 new properties a year. We're nowhere near that. I think latest statistics suggested it was about 100,000. So we're not where we need to be. If you go to look at various charities, so I've just pulled out from Shelter, their report in 2019 also highlighted the issue around social housing, that social inequity, people needing homes, being a particular problem. And they suggested that actually we need 3.1 million new homes in the UK over the next 20 years. There's this horrible mismatch of what we need and what is being kind of created. The chart on the right is just showing us where we need to kind of get to in terms of reducing that energy demand. You'll see that on the left-hand side we've got the kind of average existing home, and on the right-hand side where we've got it reducing massively that heat demand that we need to support that energy reduction in terms of the grid. So we have a massive challenge. It is possible. Technologically, we know what we need to do. We're just not seeing it at scale. I touch on this just very briefly. It's a perfect storm. The board that I sit on with a local social landlord is absolutely seeing all of these things. Rising fuel costs are inhibiting the ability to switch from, say, a gas boiler to an air source heat pump because electricity prices are significantly higher than gas. So by doing that to a tenant, you are effectively trying to push them into fuel poverty by trying to reduce the amount of carbon and decarbonising that. So it's a massive, massive challenge in social housing. Recovery from COVID-19 lockdowns. My case study was shut down March 2020. They'd got the foundations in. Construction sites were shut. You couldn't kind of go anywhere near them. People were furloughed as well. And then kind of people coming back in as the kind of restrictions were lifted. The costs of construction have gone through the roof. So the viability and the ability for landlords to build new properties is also really, really a challenging picture. We also have this challenge about being net zero, reducing our emissions, trying to keep to 1.5 to 2.5, whatever figure we would like to pick. If you look at research around Manchester and kind of most likely future kind of similar cities, we can draw attention to Montevideo in Uruguay, which is where Manchester is most likely to be now. So as part of my research, I'm looking at how the social housing currently in Montevideo is kind of designed differently, and therefore thinking, okay, well actually what could we do for Manchester? And kind of having a look at that. But it's absolutely a perfect storm of problems, challenges, that is really complex to try and unpack and deal with. I've touched on this in terms of heating demand and cooling demand. Climate change isn't going to alleviate our need for heating our homes. We will need to have that level of thermal comfort, so we will need to still be able to feel warm and kind of be able to kind of maintain our body systems. But what we are seeing is actually we will have some element of cooling demand coming into that picture. If we're still having heating demand and we still then see cooling demand coming into that, we're not necessarily seeing a reduction in our consumption. So we need to think about how we can address this, how we can think about passive opportunities. One of the key problems, and I try not to bring football into things, but I have bought Chelsea, not a blue or red from Manchester, is that we have so many housing ministers. Continuity of ability to change policies is really hard when you don't have that continuity. You might argue that the performance of Chelsea is very similar, but we have this lack of progress about where we need to get to, particularly around social housing, but in terms of private as well. So, my case study is based in St Helens, utilising the CIVSE weather files, so there are future weather files as well, so 2050, 2080. For those of you who ever might want to go to St Helens, it's kind of near Liverpool, but still on kind of near Manchester as well. And you can see the estate is just here. So it's an infill project for a northwest-based social landlord, built to 2016 Part L regulations. So in the UK, we have building regulations. You have to meet those. Since these were built, the building regulations have seen an uplift. So one of my modelling projects will be to put in those new requirements and see how it performs. Interestingly, the project is off-site construction, so it's not a traditional build, built off-site in kind of pods and craned in. This is another kind of innovative element to it. Again, construction has a problem with recruitment, with skills gaps. So very quickly, this is kind of what it looks like. So they are 2- and 3-bed terraces. This is a really interesting piece that I always like to kind of pull up, is about how the influence of sun and solar gain really plays a part. So this is a really crude model. It was literally taken from the architect's drawings and imported into the IES virtual environment. But what I wanted to kind of have a look at is internally some of the shadows. So hopefully it will play. So when we're talking about heating and cooling demand, overheating comes into play. And if you see where the shadow is being cast, that is a really kind of important part to consider, because when we have bedrooms, we don't want those to overheat. So part of my research will be looking at where we're placing those particular rooms. Interestingly, I'll be able to get out the data in terms of the demand and the profiles, depending on who's living in there and their kind of arrangement. In terms of what I'm kind of proposing to kind of go forward, and this follows on from my literature review research, is really thinking about overhangs, so preventing summer solar gain but still encouraging winter. Increased ventilation options, mostly passive rather than mechanical, and the use of possible external shutters. So again, going back to Montevideo in Uruguay, the properties there have a lot of kind of external shutters as a traditional feature. Why is this important? This is deaths from heat mortality. So when we have heat events, this is what we are seeing. So we're seeing an increase in deaths related to overheating. In conclusion, climate resilient homes absolutely are possible. They are there to react to the changing climate, to be able to withstand those changes that we know that we will see in terms of the scenarios and the science-based weather bars that we get. Homes that we see being built now will be absolutely vulnerable to 2050, 2080. If anyone is in a south-facing flat that isn't cross-ventilated in the middle of Manchester in the summer, those are going to be some of the most challenging situations to be in. People matter, human health matters. That's why it's kind of really, really important. But what we do know is that we can design them, we can build them, we're just not at scale at present. And I think that's almost it. So, exploring orientation, different weather files, again, you think about that. Considering furniture, so the model I showed you didn't have any furniture in. That would be a really interesting element to kind of explore. Things like curtains, sofas, how they kind of interact. And I'm currently interviewing lots of kind of housing, construction, policy people to kind of understand their perceptions and opinions on it. and really trying to do a lot of policy engagement, so doing a lot of work with Tyndall Manchester. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Claire. You have a question? At the front.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was very interesting. Most interesting for me because I finished my PhD on housing industry in the UK 2 years ago, and but compared to you, I was more working on the, first of all, not social housing. It was like commercial, private housing industry, and also it was on incumbent house builders, like those volume house builders, massive builders. So what I heard from you, and also I was comparing during the time that I was doing interviews with the experts in that field, was they were all mentioning that we have enough demonstrations and small projects. We need to scale it up. And the main problem with scaling it up was two major actors in this country, the housing policymakers and housing major house builders. The policymakers, one of the main problems that you mentioned was like that frequent churn of housing ministers. It's like they just come and go and they just want short-term kind of results. That doesn't work in housing industry. And the other one is that the house builders don't want to change because it's profitable and their business model is completely not based on building houses, on sitting on land. So we know the problem, we know the solution, we have enough technological innovations, we have enough projects that show that it is feasible. How can we scale it up?
And that, did everyone hear that at the back? So it's about scaling up kind of improvement. So yeah, absolutely, we have loads of really great examples of how to do it. It's that, for me, and this is my opinion, I think it's very much that resistance to change. So I used to work for a construction company before I started my PhD, and there was a lot of, well, we've always done it this way. We've always done it this way. Well, technically you haven't, because things do change, and building regulations change, and health and safety laws change. You didn't used to have to wear a hard hat on most construction sites, but now you do. So I think it's part of that communication, that long-term planning, I think is really important as well, and that's one of the big things that is missing. We're still waiting on the Future Home Standard. When's that coming in? And that's a massive challenge. But one of the real positive things that I'm really looking forward to is engaging with DESNES, and we're arranging a visit to a social landlord project to really see on the ground some of those issues. So issues around uncoupling from the gas grid, how that can kind of respond. So I think it's about influencing construction, supporting that, training, education come into that, but it's also about getting into policymakers and really trying to push through that change. It's quite slow at the moment, but I am again optimistic that actually incrementally we will eventually get there.
Fantastic. Stay